Put your hands off that paper, before I have the state police drag your oversized shadow out of this house." Thomas Sterling snarled, his voice pitching high into the freezing air of the kitchen as his fingers white-knuckled the gold cap of his pen. He did not look like a man who managed a regional asset firm anymore. His expensive wool coat was twisted awkwardly, and sweat was beginning to bead along his hairline despite the sub-zero wind howling against the window panes. Across the scarred oak table, LeBron James did not flinch, his massive 6'9" frame standing perfectly still beneath the water-stained ceiling like an ancient, immovable oak tree that had weathered 1,000 storms. He simply extended one heavy, scarred hand and pressed his palm flat against the yellow eviction notice, his dark eyes locked onto Thomas with a quiet, terrifying calm that made the entire room lose its air. "I am not asking you to leave, Sterling," LeBron said, his deep voice carrying a low, vibrating rumble that made the ceramic mugs on the counter rattle against each other. "I am telling you that this house belongs to Clara Finch, and your company is done breathing her air." Thomas let out a jagged, defensive laugh, his eyes darting toward the narrow hallway as if searching for a camera crew or a line of security guards that simply did not exist. "This is a lawful repossession of a $70,000 default. You arrogant piece of trash," he spat, his teeth baring as he stepped closer, trying to use his posture to reclaim a room that had already been completely stolen from him. "You think because your face is on a billboard in Indianapolis, you can walk into Gary and rewrite the banking laws with a gray sweatshirt and some dirty boots?" The silence that followed was heavy and physical, pressing down on the shoulders of 76-year-old Clara Finch until her breath came in small, ragged gasps. She looked between the two men, her wrinkled hands shaking so violently she had to grip the fabric of her faded blue cardigan just to keep from collapsing onto the linoleum floor. In the corner, the small space heater groaned, its coils glowing a deep, angry red that did not do a single thing to ease the bitter cold. LeBron did not look down at the paper, nor did he look at the blue plastic milk crate sitting at his feet with a rusted chain swung through the handle. He just leaned forward slightly, his shadow completely swallowing Thomas until the banker had to take an instinctive step backward into the shadow of the refrigerator. "You have exactly 60 seconds to pack your notepad," LeBron whispered, his eyes narrowing into cold, heavy slits that had nothing to do with sport and everything to do with survival. "After that, we find out what happens when you try to move a man who grew up on these streets." But to understand how a billionaire athlete ended up standing in a freezing kitchen on Harrison Street, threatening a corporate fixer over an ordinary piece of plastic, you have to hit rewind on the tape. You have to back up 3 weeks past the screaming headlines, past the luxury jet idling on a private runway in Chicago, all the way to a snow-drifted highway outside of Akron, Ohio. You have to go back to the exact moment the past finally caught up with the present. The neon sign outside Miller's Fuel and Service did not hum so much as it buzzed, a low, erratic frequency that died every few minutes before shivering back to life under the gray Ohio sky. It was late November, the kind of afternoon where the cold did not just sit in the air, but seemed to rise directly from the cracked asphalt, thick with the smell of unwashed diesel, wet salt, and rotting oak leaves. Inside the station, the linoleum floor had long ago given up its original color, worn down by decades of muddy work boots into a dull brownish grit that tracked all the way to the back counter. A single glass cooler in the corner groaned against its own aging compressor, vibrating 3 rows of generic soda cans that had probably been sitting there since the high school football state championships. LeBron James stood in front of the plywood bulletin board beside the coffee machine, his shoulder blades nearly blocking the entire view of the counter behind him. He held a cardboard cup in his massive hand, the paper soft from the cheap black liquid inside. Though he had not taken a single sip since he stepped out of his truck 20 minutes ago. His breath left his lips in small, thin plumes that vanished into the warmth of the room, his eyes scanning the chaotic overlapping layers of paper that told the quiet history of a town running out of time. There were notices for missing hunting dogs with phone numbers water-stained into illegibility, flyers for high school car washes that had happened in August, and handwritten offers for seasonal tractor repair that nobody could afford anymore. Right in the center, pinned with a single rusted tack that had bent under the pressure of a hammer, was a small, blue index card that looked like it had been torn from a school notebook. The handwriting was wobbly, the ink from a cheap ballpoint pen fading into the fibrous paper, but the message was written with a desperate, heavy precision. For sale, 1988, plastic milk crate and basketball setup, original chain netting, $15 or best offer. Contact Clara Finch, Harrison Street, Gary, Indiana, 219-555-0143. The man behind the counter was 68-year-old Toby Vance, his skin weathered to the texture of an old baseball glove from 40 winters spent working the pumps without gloves. He was wiping a grease stain off a socket wrench with a red shop rag that had seen far better days, his eyes squinting through the thick lenses of his spectacles at the giant man blocking his coffee station. He had seen people look at that board before, mostly long-haul truckers, looking for cheap firewood or teenagers looking for a junk lawnmower to tear apart in their backyards. But nobody had ever stood before it with the kind of intense, motionless reverence that this stranger was showing. Toby tucked the rag into the waistband of his oil-stained trousers, cleared his throat with a dry, gravelly cough, and leaned his elbows against the Formica counter. That setup's been gone from the yard for 20 years, but Clara won't let nobody take that card down, Toby said, his voice flat and unhurried like the landscape outside. Her husband Arthur built it out of scrap metal, back when the steel mills were still throwing off smoke. But he's been in the ground 4 years now, and the weeds are about done covering the pole. LeBron did not look away from the blue card, his fingers tightening slightly around the cardboard coffee cup, until the plastic lid popped loose with a tiny, sharp hiss. "Who is Clara Finch?" LeBron asked, his voice a low, heavy bass that seemed to absorb the ambient rattle of the old refrigerator in the corner. Toby spat a small piece of tobacco into a plastic cup beside the register, his eyes traveling up the massive frame of the stranger's gray sweatshirt before settling on the heavy lines around his jaw. "She's just a woman who stayed behind when everyone else packed their trailers and headed south for the warehouse jobs," Toby replied, turning the socket wrench over in his hand. "Arthur used to drive the regional coal routes up through Akron, a real quiet giant who never let a kid walk past his truck without checking if they had a coat on their back. Now the banks got their lawyers circling that little house on Harrison Street because the pension died when the trucking line went under, and Clara's just about out of things she can sell to keep the oil tank filled." LeBron extended his right hand, his thick fingers moving with an unexpected gentleness as he pried the rusted tack out of the plywood board, leaving a tiny dark hole in the wood. He folded the blue index card once, very carefully, sliding it into the front pocket of his gray hooded sweatshirt until it rested flat against his chest. He reached into his jeans, pulled out a crumpled $50 bill, and laid it flat on the grease-stained counter without asking for his change. "Can I use your landline?" LeBron whispered, his eyes turning toward the window where the first large flakes of an Indiana blizzard were beginning to stick to the glass. Toby did not ask any questions, simply sliding the ancient black plastic receiver across the counter until the coiled cord stretched to its absolute limit. LeBron dialed the 10 numbers from memory, his thumb covering 3 buttons at once as the line clicked and groaned through the old regional switching stations. It rang 5 times, each tone sounding long and hollow like an empty hallway, until the small, breathless voice of an old woman answered from a house 4 hours away. "Hello, Harrison Street residents," Clara said, her voice thin but carrying that stubborn old-world politeness that did not change for strangers. "My name is LeBron," he said quietly, his boots shifting slightly on the gritty linoleum as he looked out at the highway disappearing into the white fog. "I am looking at a card about a basketball setup on Harrison Street, and I would like to come see what is left of it tomorrow morning, if you have the time." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the wire, the sound of a distant radiator clanking against a baseboard, the only indication that the line had not gone completely dead. "You're coming a long way for some old plastic and a rusted chain, son," Clara whispered, her voice slowing down until it was nearly just air. "The yard is full of snow, and the gate don't open right anymore since the frost hit." "I don't mind the snow," LeBron said, his face perfectly still, as he handed the black receiver back to Toby. "I will see you at 9. He walked out of the station before Toby could even look up from the $50 bill, the heavy glass door rattling in its aluminum frame as the winter storm slammed into the building. 40 miles away in Gary, Indiana, Clara Finch set her white ceramic mug down on the kitchen counter, her old eyes staring out through the frosted glass at the dark shape of Arthur's empty workshop zone. She reached up to untie her apron, her fingers trembling just enough to make the fabric slip through her grip twice before she could fold it over the back of her husband's empty chair. The house around her felt impossibly large, the silence pressing into the corners of the living room where the photographs of 3 generations of family had started to yellow under the glass. She went to the window and watched the snow accumulate on the rusted metal rim still hanging from the old wooden pole in the alley. It looked like a ghost waiting for a game that had ended 30 years ago. She went to bed. The radiator in the hallway of the Harrison Street house let out a sharp, metallic hiss that sounded like an animal catching its breath in the dark. It was exactly 8:54 a.m. when LeBron James pulled his vehicle to the curb, the tires crunching softly against the hard, frozen crust of the snow that had drifted against the iron fence. The house was a modest, double-story frame building with pale blue paint that had long ago begun to crack and peel away in long gray strips near the foundation. 2 concrete steps led up to a narrow porch where a rusted green metal glider sat motionless, its chain frozen solid into a single awkward angle that looked like it had not moved since the previous summer. Clara Finch stood by the kitchen sink, her fingers wrapped around a faded dish towel, as she watched the massive man step out into the bitter Indiana morning. He did not look like the figures she saw on the television screen during the rare moments she turned on the old set in the parlor. There were no flashing cameras, no sleek suits, and no parade of young men with wires in their ears trailing behind his heels. He walked with his chin tucked into the collar of his gray hooded sweatshirt, his eyes fixed on the cracked concrete sidewalk, as if he were studying the path for ice before he took each slow, heavy step. He stopped at the bottom of the porch, his eyes lifting to the small, hand-painted wooden sign above the doorbell that read the Finch family since 1974. The knock on the door was surprisingly soft, a brief, polite rattle of the glass pane that did not match the sheer size of the fist that had made it. Sarah Finch, Clara's 23-year-old granddaughter, opened the door with her winter coat already wrapped tight around her shoulders, and a stack of nurse textbooks clutched against her chest like a shield. She froze instantly on the threshold, her mouth opening slightly as her brain struggled to reconcile the living, breathing giant standing on her porch with the global icon whose jersey hung in the window of every sporting goods store in Indianapolis. LeBron did not speak right away, simply lifting his right hand in a quiet, hesitant wave that instantly broke the tense stillness of the cold morning air. "Good morning," LeBron said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to carry the cold of the highway with it. I am here about the index card." Sarah stepped aside, without a word, her boots sliding slightly on the linoleum of the entryway, as she gestured toward the small kitchen, where the smell of burnt toast and cheap chicory coffee hung low under the yellow ceiling lights. LeBron wiped the snow from his heavy work boots twice on the bristly doormat, his massive frame bending slightly as he entered the low-ceilinged hallway, his shoulder almost brushing the framed black-and-white photographs lining the narrow wall. He stopped before a small silver-framed portrait of a man in a dark canvas mechanic's jacket, the man's face heavily lined and his eyes wide, direct, and completely devoid of fear. The name tag stitched over the jacket pocket read Arthur, and below it, a small brass pin shaped like a Mack truck gleamed faintly in the dim hallway light. LeBron stood before that photograph for a long time, his breath coming in slow. Even measures that showed the absolute stillness of a man who had spent his entire life learning how to control his own gravity. "That was my husband, Clara," said from the kitchen doorway, her small voice cutting through the silence of the hall like a small bell ringing in an empty church. "He drove the cold storage routes between Chicago and Pittsburgh for 34 years, and he never once missed a delivery or left a man stranded on the shoulder." LeBron turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting the old woman's faded gaze with a deep, wordless understanding that made Sarah lower her textbooks to the small telephone table by the stairs. He did not look like a stranger in that moment. He looked like a piece of the house that had finally been brought back after being lost on the road for 30 years. He walked into the kitchen, his head clearing the doorframe by mere inches, and took a seat at the old oak table where Arthur's empty chair sat directly across from him. The wood of the table was scarred with deep, parallel grooves from decades of heavy toolboxes being laid down after long shifts. The varnish completely went away where Arthur used to rest his heavy elbows every single night before dinner. For LeBron, the smell of that kitchen did not belong to Gary, Indiana. It belonged to a small, drafty apartment on Hickory Street in Akron during the winter of 1993. It was the smell of damp wool blankets drying over a single-floor register, of water boiling on a hot plate because the gas had been cut off again, and of the terrifying, hollow silence that comes when a mother has to tell her 8-year-old boy that there is nothing left in the cupboard but salt. He remembered sitting on a plastic milk crate in the corner of that dark room, his knees pressed against his chest to keep the shivering away, watching his mother wipe her tears with the sleeve of a borrowed coat while the snow rattled against the thin window pane like gravel. An old truck had pulled into the alley that night, its heavy diesel engine groaning in the sub-zero dark, before a tall man in a canvas jacket knocked on the door with 2 bags of groceries and a heavy plastic crate under his arm. "You look like you're carrying a heavy memory, son," Clara whispered, setting a blue ceramic mug of tea down on the oak table before him, her hand trembling just enough to spill a single dark drop onto the wood. LeBron wrapped both of his massive hands around the warm mug, his fingers completely hiding the blue ceramic from view as he looked down into the dark liquid. "I'm just remembering a man who didn't look at the color of a child's skin or the address of a broken apartment before he decided to help," LeBron murmured, his voice dropping into a register so quiet it was nearly just a whisper. "He gave me a reason to think the winter wouldn't last forever." The kitchen became perfectly quiet again. The only sound the slow, rhythmic ticking of the plastic cat clock on the wall above the refrigerator. Sarah stood in the doorway, her eyes moving between the massive athlete and her grandmother's fragile form, sensing the invisible thread that had just pulled tight across 3 decades of silence. The sharp sound of car tires screeching against the frozen slush outside shattered the fragile quiet of the kitchen like a stone through a window. A sleek midnight black sedan with corporate plates had pulled up directly behind LeBron's vehicle, its heavy exhaust casting thick, gray plumes of smoke into the frozen Indiana air. Thomas Sterling stepped out of the passenger side, his polished leather shoes sinking into the unplowed snow, as he pulled the collar of his tailored cashmere coat up against the biting wind. He did not look at the neighborhood with curiosity or pity. He walked toward the porch of the Harrison Street house with the aggressive, fast-paced stride of a man whose time was measured in billable minutes and corporate percentages. He did not bother to knock this time, pushing the heavy wooden front door open with a sharp shove that sent a blast of sub-zero wind straight down the hallway. He marched into the small kitchen with a thick yellow ledger clutched under his arm, his golden fountain pen already uncapped and held between his white-knuckled fingers like a weapon. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the massive shape of LeBron James sitting at the oak table, but his surprise lasted only a single second before his face hardened into an expression of cold, professional disgust. He assumed this giant stranger was just another broke relative from Chicago, some basketball-playing cousin who had shown up to hold the old woman's hand while the movers took her sofa. "We are finished with the extensions, Mrs. Finch," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the warm smell of tea like a rusty blade. "The regional board in Indianapolis signed the final foreclosure decree at 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon, so any conversation you are having with your family members right now is officially a waste of my time." Clara Finch did not lift her eyes from her blue ceramic mug, her small shoulders tightening until her faded cardigan looked almost too large for her fragile frame. Her fingers clutched the edge of the scarred table, her breath coming in tiny, shallow gasps as the physical reality of losing her home seemed to age her 10 years in a single moment. Sarah moved instinctively to stand behind her grandmother's chair, her young face pale with an anger she could not express to a man who held the legal power to lock their front door forever. The small space heater in the corner hummed its weak, desperate tune, its red coils failing completely to warm the air that Thomas had brought into the room with him. Thomas took a step closer to the table, slamming the yellow ledger down on the wood right next to LeBron's heavy forearm with a loud, intentional thud. "Look at the numbers yourself, big guy," Thomas sneered, his eyes flicking down at LeBron's dusty work boots and the frayed cuffs of his plain gray sweatshirt. $64,000 in primary default, $12,000 in accumulated county tax liens, and an estate that hasn't generated a single dime of black ink since Arthur Finch died in that back bedroom. You can sit there and look heavy all morning if it makes you feel good, but unless you have a corporate wire transfer hidden in the pocket of that oversized hoodie, you need to help the lady pack her boxes and clear the driveway. LeBron James did not move a single muscle, his massive hands remaining wrapped around his blue mug, as his eyes stayed fixed on the dark liquid inside. He did not lift his chin to defend his name, nor did he use his global stature to push the arrogant banker out of the room, choosing instead to absorb every single drop of disrespect with a quiet, terrifying dignity that made the kitchen feel smaller by the second. He just sat there like a mountain in a storm, his silence so heavy and complete that Sarah stopped breathing just to see if the giant would finally snap. The only indicator of the fire burning beneath his chest was the slow, steady rise and fall of his shoulders under the thick gray fleece. Thomas let out another short, dry laugh, his confidence growing as he mistook LeBron's calm restraint for the helpless defeat of an ordinary man with no options left. "That's what I thought," Thomas muttered, spinning the yellow ledger around and pointing his golden pen toward the bottom line of the eviction document. "Sign the voluntary surrender paper now, Clara, or I call the county sheriff's department for my car, and we start throwing these ceramic birds into the snow before the noon whistle blows." The room temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees in an instant, the silence pressing against the walls until the wood of the old house groaned under the strain. LeBron slowly set his mug down on the table, the ceramic making a soft, dull click against the oak that sounded louder than a gunshot in the dead quiet. Tôi sẽ tiếp tục viết asterisk HT5 The Hidden. Trong hồi này, bước ngoặt của câu chuyện sẽ xuất hiện. Sarah, cháu gái bà cụ, mang vào một chiếc hộp cũ chứa đựng tập tài liệu và chiếc rổ nhựa có liên quan đến quá khứ. LeBron James vẫn giữ sự im lặng, đầy tôn nghiêm, rút tập séc cá nhân và viết một con số không tưởng để mua lại toàn bộ căn nhà, lật ngược thế cờ ngay trước mũi gà phản diện Thomas Sterling. The gold cap of Thomas's pen clicked twice in the heavy silence, a sharp, metallic rhythm that sounded like a countdown ticking away in the frozen room. He leaned further over the table, his eyes wide with a predatory hunger that had nothing to do with the freezing cold and everything to do with a corporate promotion waiting for him in Indianapolis. Sarah did not move from her spot behind her grandmother's chair, but her hand shifted slightly, her fingers brushing against an old dust-covered cardboard shoebox she had quietly retrieved from Arthur's hallway closet. While the two men were locked in their silent battle, she set the box down on the far edge of the oak table, its corners split open and held together by yellowed masking tape that smelled faintly of old motor oil and cedar shavings. LeBron James did not look at the banker. His eyes moved slowly toward the shoebox, his large fingers releasing his grip on the blue tea mug as he reached out to touch the frayed cardboard with an unexpected reverence. He pulled the lid back with a gentle single movement, revealing a stack of faded carbon copy logbooks from the mid-1990s, 3 expired commercial driver's licenses, and a torn piece of a local newspaper from Akron, Ohio. Right at the bottom of the box lay a faded blue marker sketch of a child's basketball court, its lines drawn with a shaky but determined hand on the back of a delivery receipt dated December 24, 1993. Thomas let out a loud, impatient sigh, his hand slapping the yellow ledger once more as he checked the gold watch gleaming beneath his tailored coat sleeve. I don't care about Arthur's old trucking receipts or whatever junk you dug out of the attic, girl. Thomas barked, his face twisting into a dark scowl as he stepped closer to Clara's chair. This is your last warning before I step out to my vehicle and call the transport trucks to clear this property. LeBron did not speak a single word, reaching into the deep front pocket of his plain gray fleece sweatshirt with a slow, deliberate movement that made Thomas freeze mid-sentence. He pulled out a leather-bound personal checkbook, its dark blue cover completely unmarked, and laid it flat over the cold eviction notice that Thomas had placed on the table. He did not ask for a calculator, nor did he look at the aggressive red columns of numbers that the asset firm had used to trap the old woman in a corner, choosing instead to open the checkbook with a single, smooth motion of his heavy thumb. He reached into his pocket once more, pulled out a simple black ballpoint pen that looked tiny between his thick fingers, and began to write. The kitchen became so perfectly still that the tiny scratch of the pen against the blue paper sounded like dry leaves scraping across a concrete driveway in the wind. Thomas stared down at the checkbook, his mouth opening slightly as his corporate arrogance began to give way to a strange, prickling sensation of unease along the back of his neck. "What do you think you're doing, big guy?" Thomas muttered, his voice losing its sharp, cutting edge as he watched the steady, unhurried movement of LeBron's massive hand. "You think you can just throw a couple $1,000s at a primary default and call it a day?" LeBron finished the last stroke of his signature, tore the check free from the binding with a single, clean pull that echoed through the quiet room, and slid the paper across the scarred oak table until it rested directly on top of Thomas's yellow ledger. Clara Finch did not move, her hands staying flat against the wood as her eyes traveled down to the small piece of paper that had just been placed between her and the man who wanted to destroy her life. But the number written in the rectangular box was not $84,000. Thomas Sterling bent over the yellow ledger, his fingers trembling slightly as he pulled the blue piece of paper closer to his face to read the numbers written in heavy black ink. The single line of text below the rectangular box did not contain a standard mortgage settlement figure, nor did it leave any room for legal interpretation or corporate gray areas. Written out in a large, steady hand that did not shake a single millimeter were the words $1,500,000 and 0 cents. Thomas blinked once, his eyes darting from the 7 zeros on the check up to the massive silent man sitting across from him, his brain completely refusing to process how an ordinary gray sweatshirt could be attached to a number that could buy his entire firm twice over. He looked down at the signature line, his thumb catching on the edge of the blue paper as his eyes focused on the final unmistakable looping curve of the name, LeBron James. The gold fountain pen slipped from Thomas's fingers, clattering against the oak table before rolling slowly into the center of the room and falling onto the cold linoleum floor with a sharp, hollow click. His face turned a sickly, pale white beneath his expensive haircut, a sudden cold sweat breaking out along his collar as the realization of his mistake hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He looked at Sarah, then at Clara's faded blue cardigan, his posture collapsing entirely as he realized he had spent the last 20 minutes screaming insults at a global billionaire in a house that was no longer under his control. The kitchen became so perfectly quiet that the sound of Thomas's ragged, uneven breathing sounded like dry paper tearing in the dark. "This is a joke," Thomas whispered, his voice pitching high into an unstable, defensive rattle that showed he had completely lost his footing. "You can't just walk into a private foreclosure action and write a personal draft for an amount that doesn't even exist on the county registry." LeBron James slowly leaned forward, his massive elbows resting on the scarred wood of the table as his dark, heavy eyes locked onto the terrified banker with the force of an oncoming train. "I just did," LeBron said, his deep, bass voice vibrating through the floorboards until the glass panes of the kitchen cabinets rattled against their brass hinges. "The account is cleared, the wire is verified by your home office in Indianapolis, and your company officially owns nothing on this block but the dirt on your shoes." Sarah reached into the old cardboard shoebox, her fingers pulling out the yellowed newspaper clipping from the Akron Beacon-Journal, dated December 26, 1993. She too-flat the check, her thumb tracing the faint, ink-smudged photograph of a battered Mack coal truck parked outside a dark apartment complex during a record-breaking Ohio blizzard. The short article described an unnamed regional driver who had spent his holiday bonus buying 3 months of heating oil and groceries for 4 struggling families on Hickory Street before disappearing back onto the highway without leaving his name. At the very bottom of the clipping, written in Arthur Finch's neat, steady handwriting, were 4 small words that explained 30 years of hidden history. "Just glad to help." Thomas stared at the clipping, his mouth opening and closing like an animal running out of air, as the entire context of the room shifted completely beneath his feet. He looked at the blue plastic milk crate sitting on the floor with its rusted chain netting, finally understanding that he had not been dealing with a bankrupt old woman, but with a 30-year-old debt that a giant had traveled 4 hours through a winter storm to pay back in full. The air in the freezing kitchen felt heavy, pressing down on his chest until his knees bent slightly under the weight of his own sudden insignificance. He tried to look down at his yellow ledger to find some clause, some legal loophole to salvage his dignity, but the red columns of numbers looked completely blank under the steady light of the window. The cellular phone inside Thomas's cashmere coat pocket burst into a sharp, demanding ring that shattered the stunned silence of the kitchen like breaking glass. He reached for it with numb, fumbling fingers, his eyes never leaving the blue check that still sat like a weight on top of his ruined eviction paperwork. The caller identification screen displayed the name of the Senior Vice President of Operations in Indianapolis, the one man who held the absolute power to destroy Thomas's corporate career with a single stroke of a pen. Thomas pressed the receiver to his ear, his voice dropping into a shaky, desperate whisper as he turned his back toward the massive shadow of LeBron James. "Yes, sir," Thomas stammered, his free hand clutching the edge of the cold refrigerator just to keep his knees from buckling completely under him. "I am on scene at the Harrison Street property right now, but there has been an unexpected third-party intervention regarding the primary lien." The voice on the other end did not whisper. It shouted with a terrifying metallic fury that carried clearly through the tiny speaker into the freezing air of the room. "You are finished, Sterling," the vice president roared, his words cutting through the banker's defense like a buzzsaw. "A senior legal representative from the James Family Trust just contacted our corporate board with a formal harassment complaint, and they have already initiated a full compliance audit against your entire regional asset division. You are to leave the premises immediately, pack your desk before the branch closes at 5, and consider your employment with this firm officially terminated for gross ethical violations." The line went dead with a dry, hollow click, leaving Thomas standing in the corner of the room with his hand frozen against his ear like a statue. He slowly lowered the phone, his eyes moving across the cracked linoleum floor to where his gold fountain pen lay gathering dust in the shadow of the stove. He looked at Clara Finch, whose chin remained lifted with that quiet, unbreakable dignity, and then at Sarah, who was watching him with a cold, unforgiving pity that hurt worse than any corporate demotion. The immense arrogance that had carried him into the house 40 minutes ago had completely vanished, leaving behind nothing but a small, terrified man who had sacrificed his humanity for a percentage point. He sat down heavily in the metal chair by the back door, his head falling into his hands as the reality of his ruin completely washed over his shoulders. "I was just following the regional guidelines," Thomas muttered into his palms, his voice breaking into a jagged, pathetic rattle that did not sound like it belonged to an executive anymore. "If I didn't clear the default by the end of the quarter, they would have handed my accounts to the next guy in line anyway." LeBron James stood up from the oak table, his massive 6'9" frame completely blocking the light from the kitchen window as he looked down at the weeping banker. "You didn't just follow guidelines, Sterling," LeBron whispered, his deep bass voice carrying a cold, heavy weight that made the walls of the old house seem to lean in. "You chose to treat an old woman like a number because you thought nobody was powerful enough to stand in your way." Thomas did not look up, his fingers digging into his temple as a single hot tear of shame finally rolled down his cheek and dripped onto his expensive coat. He had spent his entire adult life believing that the ledger was the only thing that mattered, that the rules protected the strong, and that people like Clara Finch were just obstacles to be cleared from the path of progress. Now, sitting in the freezing kitchen of a house he could no longer touch, he finally understood that some promises were written in a language his corporate books could never track. He pulled his yellow notepad into his briefcase with shaking hands, his movements fast and clumsy, like a thief trying to escape into the dark before the lights came on. He walked down the narrow hallway without looking back, the front door slamming shut behind him with a dull, heavy thud that sounded like a final judgment. The snows of that brutal December eventually melted, giving way to the soft, pale green of Indiana spring that arrived like a quiet blessing on Harrison Street. The house with the peeling blue paint did not look like a monument to ruin anymore. Teams of local carpenters had spent 3 weeks replacing the rotted cedar siding, fixing the sagging porch steps, and sealing the roof with thick, dark shingles that smelled of clean tar in the morning sun. The groaning space heater in the kitchen corner had been replaced by a modern, silent heating system that kept the rooms perfectly warm without a single metallic rattle. Through the newly washed glass of the kitchen window, the garden beds where Arthur used to plant his summer tomatoes had been turned over and cleared of weeds, their dark, rich soil waiting for the first seeds of the season. Clara Finch sat at the oak table where the columns of red numbers had once threatened to rewrite her family's history, her laptop open beside a pristine stack of advanced medical textbooks. She did not have to work the late-night graveyard shifts at the regional clinic just to clear her tuition balances anymore. Her position at the university hospital fully secured by a quiet anonymous endowment that had landed in the dean's registry 2 days after the new year. She turned a page of her textbook, her highlighter cap clicking softly in the warm, sunlit air of the room as she looked over at her grandmother. Clara stood by the stove, her fingers moving with a light, unhurried ease, as she poured boiling water into a fresh ceramic teapot that had no cracks along its rim. The small blue index card that had spent 2 months gathering grease at Miller's Fuel and Service was gone from the world, but its spirit had rewritten the entire block. Every Wednesday afternoon, 4 young boys from the lower end of Harrison Street would walk past iron fence, their worn sneakers crunching softly on the clean gravel driveway that Arthur had laid down 30 years ago. They did not come to clear boxes or duck from the wind. They came to use the pristine, heavy-duty steel basketball hoop that the James Family Trust had erected directly over the old wooden pole in the alley. The blue plastic milk crate, with the original rusted chain netting, had been carefully removed from the elements, cleaned of its 30 winters of grit, and mounted behind a thick sheet of protective glass on the wall of Arthur's old workshop. It sat there beneath the silver portrait of the truck driver, a permanent anchor that reminded child who walked through the gate that their worth was not calculated by the size of their pockets. The regional asset firm in Indianapolis had gone through a silent, sweeping reorganization that spring, their aggressive foreclosure practices completely stripped from the corporate handbook after the public audit shook the board. Thomas Sterling was seen occasionally downtown, his tailored cashmere coat replaced by a plain canvas jacket as he walked toward the regional employment office with a worn leather briefcase held tightly under his arm. He had not found another position in the banking sector, his name permanently flagged on the state registry after the gross ethical violations on Harrison Street were formally documented by the compliance lawyers. He stopped by the chain-link fence of the neighborhood park one Tuesday morning, watching a group of teenagers chase a worn orange ball under the bright spring sky without a single notepad in his hand. He stood there for a long time in the quiet warmth, his head tilted down to slightly, as he finally began to understand the weight of the invisible things he had tried to destroy. The house on Harrison Street had become a sanctuary for the neighborhood, a place where people dropped by just to leave a box of tea or check if Clara needed her lawn mowed. Clara Finch looked out at the boys playing in the alley, her wrinkled face softening into a deep, beautiful smile that had no fear left behind it. The evening sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a long amber glow that stretched across the clean oak table and illuminated the row of hand-painted ceramic birds on the windowsill. The cat clock on the wall had stopped its frantic ticking, its plastic pendulum swinging in a slow, rhythmic cadence that felt completely aligned with the quiet peace of the house. Clara Finch stood by the kitchen door, her fingers resting lightly on the brass latch. As she looked out at the silent alley, where the dark shadow of the new basketball hoop stood tall against the purple sky, she could still hear the faint, distant echo of children's laughter fading into the dusk, a sound that filled the empty spaces of the yard like a warm blanket. She walked slowly back to Arthur's old workbench in the rear garage, her boots making no sound on the gravel path that had been cleared of the winter's heavy ice. She reached out and picked up the grease-stained mechanic's manual from the top shelf, her thumb opening the worn binding directly to page 47, where the old yellowed newspaper clipping still sat. She did not read the words about the storm or the truck driver again, choosing instead to trace the small, faded ink of her husband's handwriting with the tip of her finger. The room smelled of clean pine, fresh paint, and the deep, permanent security of a promise that had finally come full circle after 30 years on the highway. She closed the book and set it back down exactly where Arthur had left it, her hand smoothing the fabric of her cardigan as she walked back toward the house. 2,000 miles away, a private jet climbed steadily into the deep black of the California night sky, its heavy engines humming a low, steady bass note that absorbed the quiet of the cabin. LeBron James sat by the oval window, his massive frame relaxed against the dark leather seat as he looked down at the sprawling grid of tiny city lights shimmering like dust motes below. He did not have a smartphone in his hands, nor was he watching the sports highlights that filled the television screens in every lounge across the country, choosing instead to stare out into the infinite stillness of the dark. His right hand remained flat against his chest, his fingers lightly feeling the shape of a small, folded piece of blue paper that rested safely inside his pocket. The long road ahead did not feel heavy anymore, the weight of his global status perfectly balanced by the quiet memory of a freezing kitchen in Gary, Indiana. He pulled the hood of his sweatshirt down over his eyes, closed them, and let the silence of the sky take him home, just glad to help.